Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time when the world was gripped by one of the deadliest pandemics in history, the Black Death. Imagine, for a moment, the air thick with fear as sickness spreads across Europe like wildfire. You might be standing in the middle of a bustling medieval town, the scent of sweat and burnt bread mingling with something far worse, the ever-present scent of death. The Black Death, this ominous, cruel plague, arrives in Europe during the 14th century, and with it comes a storm of panic, ignorance, and some downright bizarre medical treatments. The plague's journey across the continent starts in the east, carried by fleas clinging to rats aboard ships. But the impact on the people it touches is nothing short of catastrophic. Whole cities crumble, entire families vanish, and there's a sense that the world is slipping through everyone's fingers. You probably won't survive this. As you make your way through these troubled times, everything you thought you knew about medicine is about to be shattered. No antibiotics, no vaccines, just superstitions, herbs, and the occasional sharp object. In this world, you're just as likely to die from a treatment as you are from the plague itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Black Death starts its rampage in 1347, creeping along the Mediterranean and sweeping through Italy, France, and eventually the rest of Europe. The death toll rises so fast, it's impossible to fathom. Within a few years, half of Europe's population is gone. Around 25 million people perish in a mere 4 years. To put that in perspective, imagine a city like Paris or Florence losing half its population in a matter of months. It's almost as if nature itself has decided to rebalance things with a cruel finality. But how did this terror arrive? Well, you can thank fleas for the introduction. The rats, of course, were the real culprits, but fleas hopping from one rat to another carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, once aboard ships. These rats spread the deadly disease to coastal cities, and from there, the plague took to land, moving faster than the desperate attempts of medieval people to understand it. By the time the plague reaches your town, you're already surrounded by rumors and myths. The people in your village start saying strange things about the miasma or bad air causing the plague. But it's not air, it's the invisible parasites. Those fleas making their way from rat to rat, town to town. You might have no clue that the answer is so microscopic, so minuscule, that you wouldn't be able to see it even if you tried. What do you do in the face of all this? Well, when you're faced with something that terrible, you do anything to try to escape it, right? Even if it's completely irrational. And the people of the medieval world are just as desperate as you might be. Historians still argue about the true origins of the Black Death. Was it a plague? Or perhaps something else? An outbreak of something that might have been entirely different, but caused similar devastation. What we know for sure is that it decimated populations, leaving entire villages deserted and shaking the very foundations of medieval life. You start to hear whispers of plagues in the Bible, and the end of days seems to be a real possibility. The Grim Reaper has set his sights on your world, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The question isn't if it'll hit, but when, as the plague spreads, the medical world reacts in some truly peculiar ways, ways that would seem laughable if the consequences weren't so deadly. You probably think that by now we've learned better than to fall for such nonsense. Right. Well, hold on to your seats because things are about to get a whole lot stranger. You'll soon learn how people used everything from the local apothecary's concoctions to bird beak masks that seemed more fitting for a witch doctor than a healer. And what about the people who survived? Was it sheer luck? Or maybe, just maybe, it was because of something far stranger? You'll find out soon enough. But right now, one thing is clear: the world as you know it has completely changed, and there's no turning back. You wake up one morning to see a strange figure approaching the village square, and you freeze. The silhouette is unmistakable: a tall, cloaked figure with a bird like mask, so bizarre and unsettling that it seems to belong more in a nightmare than a waking world. But as the figure draws closer, you realize something even stranger. This is no Halloween costume. This is a plague doctor. Now, the sight of someone wearing this mask probably feels like you're living in a bad dream. But in medieval Europe, this was a very real and terrifying part of life. The plague doctor's mask, often made of leather and filled with aromatic herbs, flowers, or spices, is supposed to filter out the bad air, the so-called miasma that was thought to carry the plague. But don't get too comfortable, because the entire idea of these doctors and their treatments is built on a foundation of pure superstition. You probably won't survive this. These doctors, with their long beaks, were thought to be providing protection, but all they were really doing was hiding their own fear behind a ridiculous mask. The real function of the mask was to act as a barrier between the doctor and the infected patient, but it did nothing to prevent the transmission of the disease. In fact, the mask's use of herbs and spices didn't have a scientific basis. Its purpose was more psychological than medicinal. If the doctor's senses were masked by pleasant smells, then perhaps they could remain detached from the horror unfolding around them. Imagine what it must have been like to wear one of those masks, with the oppressive weight on your head and the smell of rotting flowers filling your nostrils. These doctors would often visit villages and townships to examine the sick, sometimes staying for days on end. But as much as you try to focus on their solemn appearance, it doesn't take long for you to realize that the mask is nothing more than a half-hearted effort to deal with a catastrophe that the medical world is utterly unprepared for. To be fair, plague doctors were some of the only professionals willing to interact with the sick, as others were too terrified to get anywhere near the infected. But did that make them effective? Not really. These doctors had very little knowledge of how the plague worked, and their treatments were just as strange as their appearance. They would often use a combination of unproven methods, like applying leeches or boiling water to the patient's skin, all in the hope of draining the illness out of the body. You can't help but wonder if you were living back then. Would you trust someone with a bird mask who was recommending that you let leeches drink your blood? I mean, we all know what happens when you trust something that promises to cleanse you, a bad haircut, or maybe a second glass of wine. But in medieval times, a leech infestation and possible death. Historians still argue whether the mask's design had any psychological value. Some believe that the mask's bird like shape was intended to ward off evil spirits, an idea rooted in folk medicine. Others say it was purely practical, designed to help doctors breathe easier in the midst of a city teeming with decay. Either way, it seems clear that the medical establishment of the time was at a loss. While they had some degree of training, their knowledge was based on centuries old practices that were largely ineffective. And as the death toll rose, their desperation only made them resort to even stranger methods. Of course, you can't help but feel that the very notion of a plague doctor wearing a bird mask represents the absurdity of medieval medicine. They were trying to control a disease they didn't understand with tools that didn't work. If anything, these figures just served as a reminder of how little humanity knew about the true nature of the plague, and how even the most well meaning medical professionals could do more harm than good. So, you might be wondering, what exactly did these doctors prescribe? What treatments did they have in their bag of medieval tricks? Well, brace yourself, because the treatments get even weirder. Plague doctors believed that the body's humors, the four vital fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were out of balance, which made the person vulnerable to illness. To fix this imbalance, they would sometimes resort to the most absurd procedures. They might recommend that you vomit, or, if you were lucky, have a bloodletting session to rebalance your humors. And yes, the bloodletting was also often done with leeches, or even through crude cuts. You can only imagine how you'd feel if your doctor recommended that you bleed out to get better. It was a time of trial and error, and most treatments were wildly ineffective or downright dangerous. Some of the medicines prescribed were little more than folk remedies, like herbal concoctions, which were, at best, placebo treatments. Some doctors even recommended a cure involving bathing in vinegar or, even more bizarrely, walking around with a piece of coral in your mouth. Yet despite the clear lack of real progress, these medical practitioners were all that stood between you and certain death. And so, as you wait for the doctor to return with their next bizarre prescription, you wonder if anyone really has the answers. Could the doctors wearing bird masks actually help? Or were they just as much victims of the plague as the rest of us? Historians are still debating the extent to which these strange practices were driven by medical necessity or simple superstition. Some say they were just doing what they thought was best with the little knowledge they had, while others claim that these practices did more harm than good. What we do know for sure is that the appearance of the plague doctor and the surreal world of medieval medicine would go on to leave an indelible mark on history. Perhaps, in some strange way, it was the beginning of medical practices we would later come to recognize as modern-day science. Or maybe it was just a bizarre, eerie chapter that people would eventually look back on and say, well, at least we've come a long way since then. You're probably starting to feel like the whole world's gone mad. First, there's the plague doctor in his bird mask, and now it seems like every doctor in the land is recommending the same thing: bloodletting. Yes, you heard right. The prescription for nearly every ailment, from headaches to the plague itself, involved making you bleed. You might wonder, how did people fall for this? And more importantly, Why did anyone think that bleeding out your life force was a good idea? You probably won't survive this. Bloodletting, as bizarre as it sounds today, was considered the gold standard of treatment in the medieval period. The basic idea behind it was that your body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if these humors got out of balance, illness would follow. Since blood was considered the most important humor, it was the first to be blamed for disease. If you were unlucky enough to catch the plague, or if you were feeling off, bloodletting was the go-to method for a cure. Imagine you're in the doctor's office. You're already feverish and nauseous, and then the doctor informs you that the key to your recovery is a good, old-fashioned bleeding session. The doctor might use a sharp instrument, usually a lancet or a specially designed knife, to make an incision and let your blood pour out. They could even attach leeches or use cupping, a method where glass cups were placed on the skin and then heated, creating a vacuum to draw blood to the surface. Sometimes they'd bleed you in multiple places, believing that by removing enough blood, they'd be rebalancing your humors and giving your body the chance to fight off the illness. Historians still argue whether bloodletting was as ineffective as we think. Some point out that bloodletting was a standard practice for centuries in Europe and the Middle East, long before the Black Death. It was also used by some of the most renowned doctors of the time, like Hippocrates and Galen, who believed in the importance of balancing the humors. But the question remains, did it ever actually work? Sure, it might have helped relieve some symptoms temporarily, but it's hard to believe that losing copious amounts of blood helped anyone survive the plague. Now, let's be real here. When you look at it through modern eyes, bloodletting seems like an incredibly dangerous, almost laughable practice. In fact, many people died from it, literally bled to death in the hands of medical professionals who thought they were doing the right thing. There's no better way to ensure you don't survive an illness than to lose enough blood to make you weaker. The idea that this would purge the body of toxins might have made sense in theory, but in practice, it was often a death sentence. In medieval times, though, bloodletting was considered one of the few tools at the disposal of physicians. It was a form of treatment that showed the limits of medical knowledge at the time. They didn't have any real understanding of how diseases like the plague spread, and with no antibiotics or vaccines, they turned to what they knew: ancient theories about humors. The result: you were subjected to methods that did more harm than good, and if you weren't careful, bloodletting could be overdone. The treatment could leave you so weak and depleted that you were more vulnerable to the disease. In some cases, people were bled multiple times in a single day, often with disastrous results. You can't help but wonder how people felt when the doctor insisted they had to be bled again. What was going through their minds as they lay there, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, regardless of how much blood they lost. Even today, bloodletting lingers in some circles as an alternative treatment, although modern versions like therapeutic phlebotomy are far less dramatic and are only used to treat specific conditions like hemochromatosis. But in the days of the Black Death, bloodletting was the go-to treatment for nearly everything, from fevers to infections to the plague itself. While it may have had some symbolic power, it certainly didn't offer much in the way of actual healing. Historians still debate whether any other treatments might have been more effective than bloodletting. Was it the lack of proper hygiene? Or was it the sheer volume of misinformation circulating at the time? Regardless of the cause, one thing's for sure: the medieval medical world was one where science took a back seat to tradition, and you, the patient, were caught in the crossfire. It's hard not to feel a little sorry for those who placed their trust in these medieval remedies. They didn't have the knowledge we have today, and as a result, they were left to rely on practices that had no basis in reality. But what does it say about medieval society? A society that was so desperate to find answers, to find hope, that they turned to the very things that were slowly killing them in the face of a pandemic. It seems the medieval world tried to use everything at its disposal, even if it meant bleeding its patients dry. As you sit in your home, listening to the gossip and whispers about the plague, you begin to hear a common refrain among the villagers. The disease is carried by miasma, or bad air. It's a theory that's everywhere, and it sounds almost scientific. The air, they say, is contaminated with poisonous vapors that bring sickness. In fact, this idea of miasma was so widely believed that it became the official explanation for many diseases, not just the plague. The theory's popularity could be blamed on the fact that sickness often seemed to appear alongside unpleasant odors, decaying bodies, rotting food, and the overall filth of medieval cities. It makes sense, right? You can't ignore the fact that the stench of death seems to linger in the air as plague victims drop one by one. You probably won't survive this. So, imagine, for a moment, that you're living in a medieval city. The streets are cramped, the sewage runs openly, and the general cleanliness is, well, less than ideal. You're constantly surrounded by filth and decay. The theory that bad air is the cause of the plague, though wrong, has a certain logic to it. It's easy to see how the sight and smell of disease could lead people to think that the air itself was the culprit. After all, air is everywhere, and it's the one thing you can't avoid. Right. But here's the thing: miasma was a widespread belief that persisted for centuries, long before germ theory was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. People believed that bad air was literally a poisonous substance floating around, ready to infect you the moment you took a breath. It was this belief that led to some of the strangest treatments for the plague and other diseases, as people scrambled to purify the air they breathed. So what did they do? Well, some of the more scientific remedies involved using strong-smelling substances to purify the air around them. You've probably heard of people carrying around bunches of herbs, flowers, and spices to ward off bad air. Some even went as far as to carry around fragrant pomanders, small metal containers filled with sweet-smelling ingredients. Some doctors and townsfolk even burned incense, or put out fires of burning wood and herbs in an attempt to clear the air of this supposed poisonous vapor. But none of it worked. As much as you'd like to believe that burning rosemary or carrying a bouquet of lavender would protect you, it's just not going to cut it against the real threat, the bacteria that you can't even see. You can almost imagine the people walking around, noses upturned and hands full of herbs, convinced that the plague was all in the air, as if the vapors floating above them were more dangerous than the fleas buried deep in the fur of rats. But that's the reality of the medieval understanding of disease. Things that couldn't be seen with the naked eye were simply assumed to be connected to something easily explainable, like stinky air. Historians still argue whether miasma theory was just a convenient explanation for a disease no one understood. Some scholars believe that the widespread belief in miasma actually helped prevent the spread of disease to some extent. After all, people did begin to take actions like removing garbage from their streets or improving sanitation efforts, even if they had no idea why it might help. So while miasma theory was utterly wrong, there was at least a positive side effect. It made people more aware of the dangers of filth, but as helpful as that might sound, it didn't really address the root cause of the plague. If miasma was real, then why didn't more people survive by simply breathing in clean air? And why didn't the fragrant herbs actually do anything? The simple truth is that they didn't work because they didn't target the right cause: the bacteria carried by fleas on rats, which were still running rampant through cities and towns. It wasn't until centuries later, with the discovery of germs and bacteria, that humanity would come to realize the truth about how diseases spread. But in the meantime, people were left to fend for themselves with nothing more than superstition and their own best guesses. The miasma theory may have been wrong, but it reflected a time when disease was still an unsolved mystery, and the answers were more about survival than science. As you ponder this, it strikes you just how much of history is shaped by these mistaken beliefs. With the plague sweeping across the land, everyone, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest merchant, tried their best to make sense of the terror they were living through. But sometimes, the only thing they could rely on was the false hope that they could purify the air or banish the poison in the wind. It's a reminder of how humanity, in times of desperation, often clings to whatever answers it can find, no matter how wrong they might be. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a medieval marketplace, the heat of the day pressing in on you, and you've just learned of a new miracle treatment to keep the plague away. This is not a cure for your cough or fever, mind you, but something even more bizarre: a protective skin treatment made from crocodile dung. Yes, you heard me right, crocodile dung. You probably won't survive this. But let's be honest, it's a lot less surprising when you realize how deeply superstition and strange beliefs shaped everything from medicine to skincare in the medieval period. In an era where the understanding of hygiene was practically non existent and disease could strike without warning, it's no wonder that people turned to the most absurd remedies they could find. Crocodile dung was believed to be an effective treatment for the plague, as well as a sunscreen against the harmful rays of the sun. In fact, people didn't just slather it on for protection against the plague, but for any number of conditions they didn't quite understand. Imagine applying a layer of foul-smelling, fermented crocodile excrement to your skin, thinking that it would act as a magical barrier against infection. The fact that it probably didn't do a single thing to help you other than make you incredibly uncomfortable didn't seem to stop anyone. What's worse, there's no real explanation for why this practice caught on. Was it the idea that the dung contained some sort of natural property that could ward off disease? Or was it simply a case of people grasping at straws? Now, it's easy to laugh at the idea of slathering yourself in animal excrement. But let's not forget that this was the age when dung medicine was a staple of treatment. If crocodile dung didn't appeal to you, there were always other options. For example, Human urine, yes. Urine was often used as a form of skin treatment. Urine was believed to have magical, purifying properties, and people would use it for everything from curing rashes to cleaning their teeth. But back to the crocodile dung. What makes this so fascinating, apart from the sheer absurdity of it, is that there was a real belief in its powers. In medieval times, the need for control in the face of disease, disaster, and pestilence drove people to turn to what they thought could give them an edge. The idea of protection, especially in the form of something so unappealing, reveals just how far people were willing to go for even a sliver of hope. Historians still argue whether this was a result of ignorance or just desperation. Some believe it was a form of primitive medicine based on folk traditions and ancient beliefs about the healing properties of animal waste. In other cultures, dung had been used in various medicinal forms for centuries, and maybe, just maybe, the idea of using dung wasn't as completely irrational as we think. But let's face it, we're not talking about something remotely close to science, just survival instincts mixed with a whole lot of superstition. And while you're slathering yourself in crocodile dung, the world around you is continuing to unravel. You're not just trying to survive the plague, you're grappling with a medical system that's as clueless as the people it's supposed to heal. These treatments didn't work, but they provided some kind of ritualistic comfort in the chaos. At least they gave people the feeling that they were doing something. And when you're up against something as terrifying as the plague, sometimes feeling like you're fighting back, even with a pile of crocodile dung, is all you can hope for. When you consider how many bizarre treatments were out there during the Black Death, you can't help but feel both sympathy and a sense of disbelief at the lengths people went to in order to ward off death. But while crocodile dung might make you chuckle today, it's an important part of understanding how medicine developed, or rather, how it didn't. During this dark chapter in history, the search for cures was often a misguided adventure in magic, mystery, and desperation. So, what can we take away from this? Maybe it's a reminder that, in times of crisis, people will grasp for anything that feels like it could offer hope. Even if that hope smells a little off, we may have learned a lot since then, but the drive for survival and the strange ways people have tried to preserve their lives hasn't changed all that much. It's not just the plague that makes people do strange things. It's the desperate need to feel safe in an unsafe world. Picture this. You're lying in a dark, candlelit room, surrounded by the smell of burning herbs and a suffocating tension in the air. The plague has claimed the lives of many around you, and you're not feeling much better yourself. The doctor enters, his bird mask still perched on his face, and instead of offering the usual bloodletting or some other absurd treatment, he tells you that the only way to save you is trepanation. Yes, you're about to have a hole drilled into your skull. You probably won't survive this. Trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into a person's skull, is exactly what it sounds like. The reasoning behind this gruesome procedure was that evil spirits or imbalances in the brain caused illness, and by making a hole in the skull, the spirits would be released or the imbalance corrected. It was an ancient practice that persisted throughout many cultures, and during the medieval period, it became somewhat common for a variety of ailments, including the plague. to be treated with this method. In theory, the idea was simple. If the body's humors were imbalanced, or if disease was caused by evil spirits, then the solution might be as drastic as opening up the head to release whatever malevolent force was lurking inside. Doctors, despite their lack of understanding of anatomy or what was truly causing the illness, believed that this invasive procedure would restore balance. But the reality of trepanation is a bit more horrifying than it sounds. If you were the unlucky one to be chosen for this treatment, there's a good chance that you wouldn't survive it. Medieval doctors didn't have the tools or techniques to perform it with precision. Most of the time, trepanation was done with crude, makeshift tools and with very little understanding of how the brain worked or what part of the skull would be the safest to penetrate. The risk of infection was sky high, and even if you survived the procedure itself, you could very easily die from the subsequent complications. Historians still debate whether trepanation had any actual benefits. Some argue that it may have worked in a limited number of cases where there was severe head trauma. Others, though, are less convinced, suggesting that the procedure was not only ineffective, but extremely dangerous. With no understanding of sanitation or how to manage infections, the practice often left patients with open wounds that became breeding grounds for deadly bacteria. As you lie there, imagining the horror of a doctor ready to drill into your skull, you wonder how anyone could possibly think this was a good idea. Maybe it was the desperation, the idea that any chance of survival was worth trying, no matter how terrifying. And yet, for all the grotesque nature of this procedure, there were a surprising number of people who believed in its power to heal. Trepanation was seen as a way to physically reboot the mind, freeing it from whatever illness was taking hold. Of course, you might be thinking, surely people must have noticed the danger, and you'd be right. Many patients did die during or after the procedure, but it didn't stop the practice from continuing. In fact, you might have heard of trepanation in the modern era, where some alternative medicine practitioners still promote it as a way to awaken or expand consciousness. In the Middle Ages, though, it was just one more desperate attempt to stave off death, albeit one that likely did more harm than good. The medieval obsession with drilling holes in skulls also reflects the limited medical knowledge of the time. When you think about it, it's remarkable that people were even willing to attempt such extreme measures without a real understanding of what was happening inside the body. The absence of anesthesia meant that the patient would endure immense pain throughout the procedure, and often the tool used for drilling was nothing more than a crude, makeshift device. Imagine the suffering involved, yet, for many, it was the best hope they had. Historians still argue about how common trepanation actually was. Some believe it was a widespread practice throughout Europe, while others think it was more of a regional oddity. What's clear, though, is that trepanation offers a dark window into the past. A past where survival meant clinging to anything, no matter how absurd, in the face of an unstoppable plague. And so, as the drill is prepared and your mind races with fear, you can't help but wonder how much longer you'll be able to endure the terror and the pain. Trepanation, with its promise of release and relief, could just as easily lead to death, and yet it was the only option many had. It's one of the many examples of how medieval medicine, though deeply misguided, was driven by the human instinct to survive, even if it meant resorting to the most extreme measures. As the plague continues to ravage your town, death tolls rise, and panic spreads like wildfire. The people around you are terrified, and in their fear, they're looking for someone or something to blame. It seems impossible to fathom how your world can be slipping away so fast. The only thing more contagious than the disease itself is the sense of paranoia and hysteria that fills the air. You hear people whispering that the plague is a punishment, a judgment from God. Others claim it's a curse brought on by dark forces. But soon, a much darker scapegoat emerges. You probably won't survive this. In the midst of all this chaos, the finger points toward the Jews. In many towns across Europe, Jews were blamed for spreading the plague, accused of poisoning wells, tainting the water, and causing the disease in a twisted combination of fear, hatred, and ignorance. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive or forced into exile. These horrifying accusations weren't based on any real evidence, just the desperate desire to make sense of an uncontrollable disaster. But the Jewish communities weren't the only ones getting blamed. Cats, too, became the subject of suspicion. Cats had long been associated with witches and dark magic, and their connection to the supernatural made them easy targets during the plague, as rats were believed to be the main carriers of the disease, and cats were known for hunting them. People quickly began to see the feline population as an evil force that needed to be eradicated. In some places, entire towns embarked on a campaign of extermination, killing cats by the hundreds in an attempt to rid themselves of the evil causing the plague. You may wonder, how could anyone believe that cats were at fault? The simple answer is fear. People were scared and grasping for any explanation that would help them understand the chaos unfolding around them. But while the rats carrying the disease were spared, the innocent cats were ruthlessly slaughtered, contributing to the further spread of the plague. With fewer cats to keep the rat population in check, the very creatures believed to be spreading the disease only grew more numerous. Historians still argue whether the persecution of Jews during the Black Death was the beginning of a long history of anti-Semitic scapegoating. It's well documented that the plague triggered violent outbreaks of anti-Jewish sentiment, but some scholars believe that these outbreaks were more a result of existing social and political tensions, not just the plague. Regardless of the cause, one thing is clear: the Jewish communities were systematically blamed for a crisis they had no part in, subjected to violence and discrimination at a time when survival itself was already in question. As for the cats, well, historians also debate whether the killing of cats truly made the plague worse. While it's clear that the extermination of the feline population allowed the rat population to thrive, and therefore may have contributed to the spread of the disease, some argue that the real damage was already done by the time the cats were massacred. It's hard to say if eliminating the cats would have made a significant difference, but there's no question that it certainly didn't help. For you, standing in the midst of these wild accusations and acts of violence, the question becomes, how do you survive in a world where no one seems to know what's real anymore? The plague continues to spread, and yet, instead of looking for real answers, people turn on each other. The scapegoating of Jews and the destruction of innocent cats represent not only the panic that gripped medieval society, but also the dangerous power of fear and superstition. In the end, what's most striking about this time is how easily people were swayed by fear. The need for someone to blame is so powerful that even the most ridiculous and harmful accusations seemed plausible. As the plague ravages your community, you're forced to watch as people make decisions that only worsen the situation, all because they refuse to accept that they're powerless in the face of the disease. It's a terrifying reminder of how quickly fear can cloud judgment, and how history has a way of repeating itself, whether it's through a fear of outsiders, animals, or anything else that feels other. So, as you watch these events unfold around you, you can't help but wonder how long it will take before the madness ends, and who will still be left standing when it does. As you trudge through the streets, the heavy toll of the plague weighing on every face you pass, it becomes clear that not everyone is turning to the medical professionals for help. In fact, some people are clinging to something even more powerful: hope. You've heard whispers about the charms and talismans people are carrying, small objects, sometimes fashioned out of bones, stone, or metal, inscribed with strange symbols. These objects are supposed to protect you, to shield you from the evil that's sweeping through the land. You can't help but wonder if these items might truly offer protection, or if they're just another desperate act of faith in a time when reason seems to be crumbling. You probably won't survive this. The practice of using charms and talismans was widespread in medieval Europe, and they were thought to have mystical powers to ward off diseases like the plague. These talismans were believed to be imbued with magical properties, often linked to saints, angels, or religious figures. Some were simple crosses or amulets with sacred inscriptions, while others were more elaborate, carved from precious stones or metals. People wore them around their necks or kept them in their homes, convinced that these small objects could provide a barrier against illness, death, and the ever encroaching sense of doom that hung over everyone. The truth, of course, is that these charms did absolutely nothing to stop the plague. But for the people who clung to them, they represented something far more important: control. In a time when so much was out of their hands, from the spread of disease to the crumbling of entire communities, these talismans were a form of spiritual insurance, a way to feel that you had something powerful standing between you and the threat of death. But, of course, not everyone agreed that these talismans worked. In fact, many physicians of the time viewed them as nothing more than superstition, mere trinkets that distracted people from the real problem. The issue with relying on charms and amulets, they argued, was that it kept people from seeking real medical treatment and the true cause of the disease. The bacteria carried by rats and fleas remained unaddressed. Yet, despite the lack of any scientific backing, the power of these charms persisted. And why not? For many, the idea that something, anything, could protect them was far more comforting than the grim reality that no amount of magic or medicine could save them. You've probably heard the phrase snake oil in modern times, a term used to describe fraudulent remedies sold to desperate people. Well, in medieval times, charms and talismans could be considered the snake oil of their day. They were marketed to the masses by priests, healers, and charlatans alike, who promised that these objects would bring safety in a time of unparalleled danger. But in the end, they did little more than provide a fleeting sense of comfort to those who had no other options. Historians still argue about how effective these charms were, but it's clear that they were far more about hope than health. Some believe that the placebo effect, where a person believes in the power of a treatment and therefore experiences real benefits, might have played a role in people's faith in these charms. If someone felt safer because they were wearing an amulet, perhaps their mental state helped them endure the physical challenges of the plague a bit longer. But that's a stretch, and it's likely that these talismans did little more than fill a spiritual void during a time when people were desperate for any sort of divine intervention. It's also worth noting that while the use of charms and talismans was prevalent in medieval Europe, the practice wasn't confined to the West. In other parts of the world, people also relied on amulets, symbols, and religious relics to protect them from illness. This widespread use of protective objects points to a fundamental human desire for control in the face of the unknown. After all, when faced with an invisible enemy, like the plague, it's only natural to reach for anything that might offer protection. Now, as you think about these talismans, you begin to realize that they represent something more profound than mere superstition. They're a reflection of human vulnerability in the face of a deadly disease. They're a symbol of our collective yearning to fight back against something we can't see, can't understand, and can't control, and perhaps, in a way, these tiny amulets were more about holding on to hope than anything else. The belief in them gave people a sense of purpose, even as the world around them crumbled. You can almost picture the marketplace, where traders hawked their charms and amulets with the same urgency as modern-day salespeople. They knew they were selling something that wouldn't work, but they also knew that their customers were desperate enough to believe in anything. The irony, of course, is that while these charms didn't stop the plague, they did offer something even more powerful, a brief escape from the overwhelming fear and uncertainty that defined the medieval experience of illness. Historians still debate whether the widespread belief in these charms slowed down the spread of the disease by encouraging better hygiene practices, or if it simply kept people in a perpetual state of ignorance. What is certain is that these objects represented the intersection of spirituality, superstition, and survival. In the end, it's not just the magical powers of these charms that captivate us. It's the way they reveal the depths of human fear and the lengths to which we'll go to stave off death, no matter how irrational it might seem. In your search for anything that might give you an edge against the plague, you've heard of people turning to herbal remedies, from the simplest of village apothecaries to the grandest city healers. Everyone seems to have their own version of the cure. The air around you is thick with the scent of dried lavender, sage, rosemary, and a host of other herbs that have been ground into powders or brewed into teas. If you're lucky, someone might hand you a concoction made from these plants, promising it will protect you from the sickness that's sweeping through the streets. But the question lingers: do these herbal remedies actually work? Or are they just another layer of desperation layered on top of a foundation of ignorance? You probably won't survive this. Herbs, in the medieval world, were seen as nature's way of fighting back against disease. And why not? Plants had long been used to treat minor ailments like headaches, fevers, and digestive issues. But as the plague ravaged Europe herbal remedies took on an almost magical significance. People believed that certain herbs like lavender, sage, and thyme held the power to ward off the deadly disease. These plants were thought to purify the air, balance the humors, and cleanse the body. If you were lucky enough to have access to them, you might be told to boil them into a potion or burn them in a fire to fumigate your house. Or, perhaps, you'd wear a pouch filled with dried herbs around your neck or keep it in your pocket, hoping that it would protect you from the invisible enemy that lurked in every corner. Of course, we now know that these remedies did nothing to stop the plague. The true cause of the disease, bacteria carried by fleas on rats, was still a mystery. But back then, people had no idea about germs, bacteria, or even the concept of contagion. So when the healing powers of herbs were touted as the solution to the plague, they provided a sense of comfort in a world that had none. You could hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, these plants could offer some form of protection. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of herbal remedies in the context of the Black Death. While we know now that these plants couldn't cure the plague, some suggest that they might have helped with other, less deadly ailments. For example, certain herbs were thought to reduce fever, soothe coughing, or ease the symptoms of illness. In a world with no antibiotics or vaccines, these small, natural remedies may have provided some relief from the more common diseases of the time. But the truth is that when it came to the plague, nothing could really help. What's more fascinating, though, is how the medieval belief in herbs reflects the intersection of science, superstition, and culture. While herbal medicine had some roots in ancient wisdom, by the time of the Black Death, many of these treatments had taken on an almost religious significance. Herbs were no longer just plants, they were magical tools linked to a divine or natural order that could somehow protect you from death. This was a time when anything, no matter how strange or unscientific, was worth a shot if it meant you might survive the plague. You've probably heard of herbalists or apothecaries who claimed to have the ultimate cure for the disease. These individuals, often regarded as healers or wise women, were central figures in medieval society, but their effectiveness was, at best, uncertain. Some of them made their living off the desperate need for cures, selling tonics, potions, and salves, many of which were based on centuries-old traditions. But for all the knowledge they might have had about common plants and their uses, the apothecaries couldn't begin to grasp the true cause of the plague. They couldn't see the bacteria or understand how it was spread. And even if their remedies did alleviate some symptoms, it was pure chance, not the herbs that made the difference. Yet, despite their utter ineffectiveness against the plague, herbal remedies persisted as a form of comfort. In a world without antibiotics or modern medicine, there was something reassuring about the thought of using natural ingredients to treat illness. People clung to these treatments, hoping they'd work, because at least they were doing something. And in times of sickness, doing something, anything, was often better than sitting idly by and feeling powerless. In many ways, herbal remedies represent the ancient world's attempt at rationalizing the unknown. When you can't explain how disease spreads, when the air is thick with the scent of death and decay, it's tempting to believe that the earth itself has the power to heal. And though these remedies didn't stop the plague, they remain an enduring part of medical history, a reminder of humanity's creativity, resourcefulness, and desperate hope in the face of disaster. Historians still argue whether the use of herbs in medieval times was driven by true belief in their powers or simply by the human need to control an uncontrollable situation. Some believe that herbal treatments provided psychological comfort, allowing people to feel like they were fighting back against a disease they couldn't see. Others believe that the use of herbs, in combination with other methods, may have at least helped people cope with the more minor effects of illness, even if it didn't cure the plague itself. Ultimately, though, it's the idea of doing something that defines the use of herbal remedies during the Black Death. It's a universal human trait. When faced with an unknown and terrifying threat, you try to grab hold of anything that might help. And sometimes, even when the remedy is as ineffective as a handful of dried herbs, that simple act of trying, it gives people something far more valuable: hope. The streets of your town are filled with a peculiar sight: groups of people, all clad in simple robes, marching solemnly and chanting prayers. Their faces are grim, their expressions twisted with a mix of determination and agony. As you watch, a horrible realization creeps into your mind. They're whipping themselves. Yes, these people, known as the flagellants, are beating their own backs with cruel, sharp instruments, flails with iron-tipped ends designed to tear through the skin. With each strike, blood flies in the air, and yet they continue, their pain somehow both voluntary and desperate. You probably won't survive this. The flagellant movement, which started as a religious fervor in the wake of the plague, spread across Europe like wildfire during the Black Death. The flagellants believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and that the only way to appease him was through acts of extreme penance. So, they took to the streets in groups, ritually whipping themselves and begging for divine forgiveness, convinced that this violent self-punishment would stop the plague in its tracks. To the flagellants, the act of self-flagellation was more than just physical pain. It was a spiritual purification. They believed that by inflicting pain on their bodies, they could purify their souls and prove their devotion to God. And while you watch these pitiful figures whipping themselves into an almost trance-like state, you can't help but feel a strange mixture of awe and horror. There's no way around it. These people are desperately trying to bargain for their lives, to force the plague to stop its deadly march through their communities. But what did this practice actually accomplish? The short answer: very little. Despite their best efforts, the flagellants didn't stop the plague, and in fact, their actions may have even contributed to its spread. The very thing they hoped to purge themselves of sin was often spread through the blood they spilled, as their wounds became infected. But for them, the idea of physical suffering was a means to earn God's favor, and in a world where the plague seemed completely indiscriminate, who could blame them for trying anything? The flagellant movement gained momentum quickly. In some places, entire towns or cities were taken over by these self-proclaimed saviors, and they often demanded that others join them in their ritualistic acts of self-punishment. The crowds would grow, with men and women alike whipping themselves in a display of piety and devotion, all the while chanting prayers for mercy and forgiveness. The whole spectacle must have been unsettling, men and women screaming in pain, their bodies covered in raw, bleeding welts, yet each one certain that they were doing God's work. But in the end, the flagellants couldn't save themselves. and they certainly couldn't save anyone else. While they believed they were offering a solution to the plague, their actions were more a reflection of their fear and confusion than a genuine path to healing. As the plague continued to claim lives around them, the movement began to lose its appeal, and religious leaders condemned the flagellants as heretics for their extreme acts of penance. But for those who had joined the movement, the question remained: what else could they do in the face of an unstoppable disease? The flagellants believed that suffering was their only option, and that through pain and devotion they could somehow earn redemption. Historians still debate the significance of the flagellant movement. Some see it as a reflection of medieval religious zealotry, an attempt to impose meaning on a world that seemed meaningless. Others view it as a symbol of the medieval struggle to make sense of a disease that defied explanation. What's clear, though, is that the flagellants were trying to take control of a world that had spiraled out of control. The Black Death was an event so devastating, so incomprehensible, that the only recourse for many was to turn to their faith in the hope that it would save them. In many ways, the flagellants were a product of their time. They were not the only ones who turned to extreme measures to stave off the plague, but they were among the most visible. Their actions represent the extreme desperation of people who had no real answers, who were left to rely on superstition, faith, and pain in their fight against an invisible, unstoppable enemy. In the face of such unimaginable horror, the flagellants believed that their suffering could be redeemed, that somehow their personal agony would bring about divine intervention. And while this may seem insane to us now, it's hard to imagine just how powerful fear and faith must have been in a time when disease struck without warning. For you, standing in the middle of it all, it's hard not to feel a little unsettled. The flagellants aren't the only ones who are desperate. Everyone is looking for a solution, some way to avoid the fate that seems to have already been decided. And as you watch these tortured souls march through the streets, you can't help but wonder if they're any better off than the rest of you. Maybe, just maybe, the real horror of the plague wasn't the disease itself, but the way it forced people to turn against their own bodies, their own minds, in an attempt to make sense of the chaos. As the plague spreads across the land, something strange begins to happen. Entire neighborhoods, even whole towns, are shut off from the outside world. What's this? A new form of social distancing. The word quarantine begins to appear more and more frequently in your town's conversations, as it becomes clear that isolation might be your only chance to survive. You probably won't survive this. The word quarantine originates from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, referring to the 40 days that ships suspected of carrying the plague were required to remain isolated at the port before being allowed to dock. In the early days of the Black Death, this idea of isolating the sick and separating the healthy from the infected gradually evolved into a more formal system of quarantine. In the medieval world, the concept of separating the ill from the well was not fully understood, but it was becoming clearer that the spread of the plague was unstoppable unless something drastic was done. Quarantine became the solution. The practice wasn't perfect. Who could have known how a tiny flea, unseen by the naked eye, could wreak such havoc? But by the 14th century, cities like Venice had already put quarantines into place, forcing ships suspected of carrying the disease to remain docked for 40 days. This meant no trading, no communication with the outside world. just a terrifying isolation in a time when the plague was a death sentence, especially in cities. Venice, which was a key hub for trade, became one of the first to adopt quarantine measures, realizing that if they didn't take drastic action, they'd face a near total collapse. Imagine, for a moment, that you're stuck in a small town surrounded by a wall of fear. You can't go to work, you can't visit your family, and you can't even step out into the marketplace. You stay at home, surrounded by your loved ones, but you're not sure if that's a blessing or a curse. What if one of them has been exposed and doesn't show symptoms yet? What if you're the one who's carrying the disease and you don't know it yet? The whole town is gripped by a suffocating anxiety. You've become a prisoner in your own home, isolated from the world and from any sense of normalcy. The town leaders would close the gates, and no one could enter or leave. Those who were sick would be confined to their homes or even put into separate buildings or hospitals, often without enough medical help to survive. There were no social services, no health insurance, no mass quarantines in place to support them, just sheer survival. You couldn't even rely on neighbors to bring you food or supplies, as the fear of contamination ran too deep. And it wasn't just people who were quarantined. Entire ships were isolated at sea for 40 days if there was any suspicion of plague on board. Goods could only be offloaded with extreme caution, and some merchants who refused quarantine protocols found themselves banned from trading entirely, exiled to islands or remote outposts where they could do no harm. In the isolated quarters of these quarantined ships, you'd find no comforts, just the knowledge that if you had the plague, you were as good as dead. The quarantine was more a death sentence than a protective measure for the ill. Historians still debate how effective quarantine was in slowing the spread of the plague. On one hand, it made logical sense. By limiting contact between the healthy and the sick, the spread of the disease could be contained. But on the other hand, people still didn't understand how the plague spread. It wasn't just about keeping the sick isolated. It was about understanding how germs worked, how diseases spread through infected fleas, and how rats carried the disease. In many cases, quarantine efforts were futile because the plague had already infiltrated, and the infected rats and fleas were the true culprits. Quarantine, however, did mark the beginning of a rudimentary understanding of disease control. It was the first step toward modern public health measures, though it would be centuries before humanity had a real grasp on how diseases spread and how to prevent them. And while it might have been the best they could do at the time, it wasn't perfect. People still believed in things like miasma theory, and the idea of keeping healthy people away from sick ones didn't address the true nature of the disease. For you, watching the world unfold in such fear and desperation, quarantine is a bitter irony. People are shut away from each other, yet still, the plague finds its way through cracks and gaps in the defenses. Families are torn apart by fear, and communities become divided in an attempt to preserve their own lives. You can't help but wonder whether isolation, despite its good intentions, has done more harm than good. Sure, it might slow the spread of disease, but it also leaves a deep, lingering psychological toll. The fear of the unknown, of not knowing who is infected or who might carry the plague without symptoms, becomes the true virus that spreads faster than anything else. As the years roll on and the plague continues to ravage Europe, the practice of quarantine evolves. It becomes a staple in dealing with all kinds of outbreaks, from cholera to smallpox, and forms the foundation of the public health measures we take for granted today. But back then, quarantine was a lifeline, a desperate attempt to stop a disease that no one understood. Historians still argue about whether quarantines actually worked in the medieval period, or if they were just a reflection of society's desperation to try anything, to do anything, to stop the plague. Regardless of their effectiveness, however, they were part of a larger movement toward an understanding the importance of isolation in preventing the spread of disease. The beginning of social isolation during the plague was one of the first public health measures, even if it was born out of ignorance and fear, and you, caught between the need to stay safe and the gnawing worry that quarantine might be as much of a death sentence as the disease itself, can't help but wonder, is this the only way to survive? Is isolation the price of survival, or is it a slow, inevitable surrender? You've seen them before, the men in long robes, their faces hidden behind masks, carrying large leather bags filled with remedies that promise to heal the sick. They're physicians, the supposed experts of the day. And yet, as the plague continues to take its toll, you can't help but wonder, who are they really helping? And how much do they actually know? You know that in a time of death and disease, people are desperate for answers. But the more you see these doctors in action, the more you start to question their competence. You probably won't survive this. Medieval physicians were a mixed bag. Some were genuinely trained in the medical practices of the time, but most of that training was based on centuries-old theories, ideas that were, at best, outdated and, at worst, dangerously incorrect. When it came to understanding the plague, these physicians were just as clueless as the rest of society. They could prescribe remedies, offer advice, and administer treatments, but their understanding of disease transmission was practically non-existent. Disease was still thought to be caused by an imbalance in the body's humors or by bad air, not by invisible bacteria or fleas. Despite their limited understanding of illness, physicians still held a great deal of authority. They wore distinctive robes, often complete with hoods and masks, and carried themselves as professionals. But in reality, most of them were simply as lost as the common folk. They had learned their craft through a combination of classical texts like those of Hippocrates and Galen and the folk medicine passed down through generations. While they may have understood how to treat basic injuries or minor ailments, when it came to the plague, they were out of their depth. The most famous image of a medieval physician is the one with the beaked mask, filled with herbs. These masks were meant to protect the doctor from miasma, or bad air, which was believed to carry the plague. The herbs, they thought, would cleanse the air before it reached the physician's nose. But the real danger, as we now know, was not in the air, but in the fleas carried by rats. And these beaked masks, they were little more than a visual display of ignorance, a desperate attempt to cling to a theory that simply didn't work. You've probably wondered what kind of treatments these doctors prescribed to the sick. Bloodletting, leeches, and even purging were common practices. Some would prescribe herbs, concoctions, or even charms, remedies that were about as effective as using a lucky rabbit's foot to ward off bad luck. The truth is that medieval physicians were stuck in a loop of old medical theories. unable to adapt to the changing needs of society. While bloodletting might have been effective for minor ailments or imbalances, it was a death sentence for those suffering from a plague. And yet, the practice continued. Despite its complete ineffectiveness, historians still argue about how much responsibility these physicians bear for the high death toll of the Black Death. Were they merely following the medical practices of the time, doing the best they could with the knowledge available to them? Or did their treatments actually contribute to the spread of the disease? Some argue that their insistence on ineffective practices, like bloodletting, may have weakened the sick and made them more vulnerable to the disease. Others suggest that physicians were simply victims of the same ignorance that plagued everyone else. Regardless of the role these physicians played, one thing is clear: they were the experts of their time, but their expertise was limited, and their treatments were often disastrous. They wore masks, carried herbs, and performed rituals, but they couldn't stop the plague. They were still bound by ancient theories of medicine that didn't understand the true nature of disease, and their medical knowledge was nowhere near advanced enough to combat something as deadly as the Black Death. Yet, for all their faults, medieval physicians did leave a legacy. The practices of the time laid the groundwork for the medical advancements of later centuries. The idea of isolating the sick, the development of quarantine measures, and the growth of public health initiatives all had their roots in this period. While medieval doctors didn't understand the science behind these practices, their efforts to contain the plague eventually led to the beginnings of modern epidemiology. But as you stand there, watching the physicians moving among the sick, it's hard not to feel a deep sense of disappointment. These men, dressed in their dark robes, are the ones who hold the power of life and death in their hands, and yet they're just as powerless as anyone else. The plague continues its march through the town, and no amount of herbs, prayers, or bleeding can stop it. You can only wonder, if these physicians were so skilled, why aren't they saving anyone? Why aren't they curing the plague? In the end, they are just another reminder of how little humanity understood about the forces they were fighting against. Historians still argue whether the medieval physician truly was an agent of change or a symbol of stagnation. Were they pioneers in their own right, working with what they knew, or were they hopelessly out of touch with the world around them, continuing practices that did more harm than good? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, but one thing is certain: as the Black Death continues to ravage the land, these physicians, despite their robes, their masks, and their best intentions, are no more equipped to stop the plague than anyone else. 12. As the plague spreads across the land, you can't help but notice that it's not just physicians with their strange masks and mystical beliefs that are trying to cure the disease. No, there's a whole other class of individuals who are capitalizing on the panic and desperation that has taken over your town: apothecaries and quacks. These self-proclaimed healers, often with no real medical training or understanding of the plague, offer remedies that range from the mildly questionable to downright absurd. But in a world where even the most educated physicians seem powerless, many people have no choice but to turn to them in the hope that something, anything, might work. You probably won't survive this. Apothecaries were the medieval version of today's pharmacists, though their knowledge was based more on ancient texts and folk remedies than on scientific understanding. They sold herbs, potions, and tinctures, often claiming that their concoctions could heal any number of ailments, from headaches to the plague itself. But just like the doctors, the apothecaries were clueless when it came to actually stopping the plague. Their remedies were based on superstition, not science, and they had no way of knowing that the true cause of the disease was bacteria carried by fleas on rats. Imagine being desperate enough to visit an apothecary, someone who promised to have the answers to your problems, someone who would sell you an elixir that could supposedly prevent or cure the plague. The shelves are lined with jars and bottles, each filled with exotic ingredients, dried roots, powders made from precious metals, and tinctures extracted from plants you've never seen before. The apothecary might tell you to take a few spoonfuls of the elixir or rub a salve on your chest, claiming that it will protect you from the deadly disease. And in a world where death feels imminent, it's easy to believe in the possibility of salvation, no matter how unlikely it seems. But what are these remedies really doing for you? If you're lucky, they might offer some relief from the minor symptoms of illness, like a sore throat or a headache. At best, they might provide a sense of comfort, a psychological boost that makes you feel like you're doing something to fight back. But when it comes to the plague, these treatments are as effective as a wish upon a star. The apothecaries themselves may be well-meaning, but they have no real understanding of how disease works. The medieval world was still stuck in an age where ailments were often explained through humors, miasma, or divine retribution. The idea of microorganisms or germs as the cause of disease hadn't even been conceived yet. And then there are the quacks, the so-called doctors who were even less qualified than the apothecaries. These individuals had no formal training and often used their charm and persuasive skills to convince people that they had the cure for whatever ailed them. Some of these quacks would sell fake remedies, while others would engage in more dangerous practices like bloodletting, using leeches, or even performing trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull. They were often itinerant, traveling from town to town, offering false hope to anyone who would pay them. And for the most part, people did pay, because when faced with something as terrifying as the plague, people will grasp at anything that offers the possibility of survival. Historians still argue about the role of apothecaries and quacks during the Black Death. Some see them as opportunistic charlatans, preying on the fear and desperation of the population. Others argue that they were simply trying to help with the limited knowledge they had, and that their remedies may have had some value, albeit in a very different context from what they believed. But one thing is certain: in a world where real medical knowledge was limited, these figures were some of the only options available to the sick and desperate. The apothecaries and quacks represent a time when medical knowledge was fragmented, inconsistent, and often downright dangerous. They were part of the system of healing that relied on a mixture of ancient beliefs, folk wisdom, and whatever scraps of knowledge were available. In the absence of modern medicine, they were the ones people turned to, hoping that anything would work. But as the plague continues to decimate the population, it becomes clear that these remedies are not enough. The reality is that the apothecaries and quacks are powerless against a disease that is as mysterious as it is deadly. The herbs, potions, and elixirs they sell might offer a fleeting sense of comfort or an illusion of control, but they can't stop the plague. And in the end, no amount of herbal medicine or folk remedies can change the fact that death is often indiscriminate and unstoppable. For you, standing in the midst of all this confusion and desperation, it's hard to escape the feeling that you're caught in a web of illusion. The apothecaries and quacks are selling hope, but it's hope built on lies and ignorance. Yet, in a time when the plague seems unbeatable, maybe that's all anyone can ask for. The comfort of knowing that someone is trying, even if they don't have a clue about what they're doing. Historians still debate whether the apothecary's role in medieval society was ultimately helpful or harmful. Were they genuinely trying to heal, or were they simply taking advantage of the situation? Regardless of the answer, they played a significant part in the story of the Black Death, a story of fear, confusion, and a desperate search for answers that didn't exist. The plague has been raging for months, maybe even years, and you're still here, but you're not sure why. Around you, friends, family, and strangers alike have fallen victim to the disease, and each passing day seems to bring more loss, more death, and yet, here you are, standing amidst the wreckage of your town, somehow still breathing. You wonder why have you survived when so many others haven't? Was it luck, fate, or just time? You probably won't survive this. You look around and realize that survival might not be as straightforward as it seems. There's no rhyme or reason to who survives the plague. One day, someone is healthy, and the next, they're gone. You could be sitting next to a person one moment, and by the next morning, their body is cold, their face bloated with the telltale marks of the disease. And yet, there you are, untouched alive. Though you feel like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer makes sense, some survivors are quick to attribute their survival to luck. I was just lucky, they say, and maybe they were. After all, the plague seemed random, hitting some and sparing others. The truth is, there's no way of knowing what factors determined who survived and who didn't. It could have been your exposure to the disease, the strength of your immune system, or perhaps a simple twist of fate. You could have been in contact with an infected person and yet escaped the disease. Maybe you were just in the right place at the right time. But whatever it was, it certainly feels like you've dodged a bullet. But as you consider your survival, you can't ignore the role that fate and chance seem to play. After all, you could have been in any number of places when the plague hit, and your story could have been very different. Fate, it seems, has its own ideas of who should survive and who should succumb to the sickness. Maybe it's a cruel game of chance, where some are chosen and others are not. But in a world where death is as inevitable as the rising sun, how can you avoid seeing it as a roll of the dice? The reality of plague survival is a complicated web of factors, biological, environmental, and perhaps even a little bit supernatural. Historians still debate the reasons why some people were able to escape the deadly grip of the disease, while others weren't. Some point to genetics, suggesting that certain individuals may have had genetic mutations that made them more resistant to the plague. Others argue that the spread of the disease wasn't entirely random, and that the areas with better sanitation or less crowded living conditions may have had a slightly better chance of survival. Still, it's impossible to pinpoint exactly why some lived while others died. Was it simply time, the length of exposure, or the type of strain of the disease? Were the survivors simply fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time? As you wander through your town, it's hard not to feel a sense of guilt. You've survived, but at what cost? Everywhere you look, there are empty homes, abandoned streets, and silent mourning. You can't escape the fact that for every person who lived, there were 10 others who didn't. The survivors, in many ways, become the ghosts of the world that once was. They are left to carry the memories of the lost, their survival marked by an unspoken question: why me? But just as survival is a random affair, so too is the mourning. The same way people have been left behind by the plague, you have been left to wonder if you're meant to rebuild what's been lost. The survivors are forced into a strange position. They must face the destruction of the world they knew, but also carry the weight of knowing that the future is still uncertain. Who else will survive? Who else will fall? In the aftermath of the Black Death, the survivors are not just witnesses to history. They are history itself. They represent the frail, resilient thread that ties the past to the future. But as you stand here, breathing the same air that claimed so many, you can't help but wonder how much of your survival is truly within your control, or perhaps how much of it is just pure luck. And that's the thing about survival. It's an unpredictable beast. You could have the best medical care, the strongest immune system, and the most reasonable precautions, and still, death might come for you. Or you could be caught off guard, surrounded by sickness, and still live to tell the tale. Luck, fate, and time all play their parts in determining who makes it through. And in a world so ravaged by plague, surviving doesn't always feel like victory. It can feel like a waiting game, a game where you never know if you're going to make it to the end. Historians still debate what exactly allowed some to survive while others perished. Was it luck, or was it something more like the right conditions or genetic resistance? The question remains one of the great mysteries of the Black Death. And as you watch the survivors, it's hard not to feel that the answer is less about biology and more about the unpredictable nature of life and death itself. The Black Death has passed through, leaving behind a trail of destruction that can hardly be described. The streets, once filled with life, now feel like ghost towns. The air is eerily quiet, and the silence of mourning hangs heavy on every corner. For those who have survived, the question is no longer about what to do during the plague, but what comes after. As you look around, you can't help but wonder, how do you rebuild after something so devastating? What has this catastrophe done to your world, and how will it shape the future? You probably won't survive this. The Black Death, with its catastrophic death toll, changed everything. The survivors, those who lived through this unprecedented loss, are now living in a world that no longer makes sense. Cities have been decimated, entire families wiped out, and society is trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces. But one thing is certain: this plague didn't just change the population of Europe, it changed medicine itself. Before the plague, medicine was based on ancient beliefs. The idea that diseases were caused by imbalances in the body's humors, or by bad air, or by the wrath of God. Medical practice was rooted in centuries-old theories passed down from Greek and Roman physicians, with little understanding of the science behind disease transmission. But as the plague tore through the population, And as medieval doctors continued to fail in their attempts to stop it, the limitations of medieval medicine became painfully clear. Doctors, apothecaries, and even the flagellants all had their place in trying to fight the plague, but none of their methods truly worked. The catastrophic loss of life was too great to ignore, and eventually, this led to the birth of modern medicine. Historians still debate the extent to which the Black Death shaped the future of medicine. Some argue that the plague acted as a catalyst for change, forcing physicians to reconsider the ancient medical models that had held sway for centuries. Others suggest that the rise of modern medicine was a gradual process, and the Black Death merely sped up the inevitable. But one thing is clear: the way people thought about health, disease, and the body was forever altered by this pandemic. Out of the ashes of the Black Death, the first seeds of modern public health were sown. Quarantine measures, which had been put into place in an attempt to control the plague, became a cornerstone of disease prevention in the future. While the medieval world didn't fully understand the nature of the disease, the practice of isolating the sick from the healthy became an essential part of controlling the spread of infectious diseases. By the time the next pandemics, like the Third Cholera pandemic or the Spanish flu, arrived centuries later, the importance of quarantine had been firmly established. The plague also brought about an increased interest in scientific inquiry, as medieval doctors grappled with the mystery of the disease. Many began to look beyond ancient texts and superstitions. The idea of using observation, experimentation, and reason to understand disease slowly began to take root. Over time, this gave birth to the scientific method, which would revolutionize not just medicine, but all of science. While it would take centuries before the germ theory of disease was established, the groundwork for modern scientific thinking was laid in the aftermath of the Black Death. But it wasn't just the medical community that changed in response to the plague. Society as a whole underwent a shift. The massive loss of life during the Black Death created labor shortages, which ultimately led to economic and social changes. The feudal system, which had dominated medieval Europe, began to weaken as peasants gained more leverage over landowners. The church, too, saw a decline in its authority as people began to question the divine explanations for the plague. Many turned to science, reason, and humanistic ideas for answers, marking the beginning of the Renaissance, a period of rebirth and innovation. For you, standing in the aftermath of such devastation, the future seems uncertain. The plague has left you with more questions than answers. You wonder how society will move forward after such a loss, and whether the changes brought on by the plague will lead to a better world, or if the shadow of this tragedy will continue to haunt you. And yet, in the midst of the suffering, there is hope. You see the survivors beginning to rebuild. The streets may be quiet, but there's a sense that the world, though scarred, will continue. In the centuries to come, people will look back at this time as a turning point, a moment when humanity was forced to face its own limitations, and in doing so, began the long journey toward an understanding. The seeds of modern medicine, public health, and scientific inquiry were planted during this dark time, and though they would take centuries to bear fruit, they would ultimately change the world. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of the Black Death, but there's no question that it reshaped society, medicine, and the very fabric of life. It was a catastrophe, yes, but it was also a catalyst for change, a reminder that out of destruction can come renewal. And as you reflect on what you've lived through, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe. The plague may have claimed so much, but it also pushed humanity forward. The survivors are the ones who will build the future, and the lessons learned in the face of death will echo through the centuries to come. Perhaps, in some strange way, this was the price of progress. You wake up one morning to see a strange figure approaching the village square, and you freeze. The silhouette is unmistakable, a tall, cloaked figure with a bird-like mask, so bizarre and unsettling that it seems to belong more in a nightmare than a waking world. But as the figure draws closer, you realize something even stranger. This is no Halloween costume. This is a plague doctor. Now, the sight of someone wearing this mask probably feels like you're living in a bad dream. But in medieval Europe, this was a very real and terrifying part of life. The plague doctor's mask, often made of leather and filled with aromatic herbs, flowers, or spices, is supposed to filter out the bad air, the so-called miasma, that was thought to carry the plague. But don't get too comfortable, because the entire idea of these doctors and their treatments is built on a foundation of pure superstition. You probably won't survive this. These doctors, with their long beaks, were thought to be providing protection, but all they were really doing was hiding their own fear behind a ridiculous mask. The real function of the mask was to act as a barrier between the doctor and the infected patient, but it did nothing to prevent the transmission of the disease. In fact, the mask's use of herbs and spices didn't have a scientific basis. Its purpose was more psychological than medicinal. If the doctor's senses were masked by pleasant smells, then perhaps they could remain detached from the horror unfolding around them. Imagine what it must have been like to wear one of those masks, with the oppressive weight on your head and the smell of rotting flowers filling your nostrils. These doctors would often visit villages and townships to examine the sick, sometimes staying for days on end. But as much as you try to focus on their solemn appearance, it doesn't take long for you to realize that the mask is nothing more than a half-hearted effort to deal with a catastrophe that the medical world is utterly unprepared for. To be fair, plague doctors were some of the only professionals willing to interact with the sick, as others were too terrified to get anywhere near the infected. But did that make them effective? Not really. These doctors had very little knowledge of how the plague worked, and their treatments were just as strange as their appearance. They would often use a combination of unproven methods, like applying leeches or boiling water to the patient's skin, all in the hope of draining the illness out of the body. You can't help but wonder if you were living back then. Would you trust someone with a bird mask who was recommending that you let leeches drink your blood? I mean, we all know what happens when you trust something that promises to cleanse you, a bad haircut or maybe a second glass of wine. But in medieval times, a leech infestation and possible death. Historians still argue whether the mask's design had any psychological value. Some believe that the mask's bird-like shape was intended to ward off evil spirits, an idea rooted in folk medicine. Others say it was purely practical, designed to help doctors breathe easier in the midst of a city teeming with decay. Either way, it seems clear that the medical establishment of the time was at a loss. While they had some degree of training, their knowledge was based on centuries-old practices that were largely ineffective. And as the death toll rose, Their desperation only made them resort to even stranger methods. Of course, you can't help but feel that the very notion of a plague doctor wearing a bird mask represents the absurdity of medieval medicine. They were trying to control a disease they didn't understand with tools that didn't work. If anything, these figures just served as a reminder of how little humanity knew about the true nature of the plague, and how even the most well meaning medical professionals could do more harm than good. So, you might be wondering, what exactly did these doctors prescribe? What treatments did they have in their bag of medieval tricks? Well, brace yourself, because the treatments get even weirder. Plague doctors believed that the body's humors, the four vital fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were out of balance, which made the person vulnerable to illness. To fix this imbalance, they would sometimes resort to the most absurd procedures. They might recommend that you vomit, or, if you were lucky, have a bloodletting session to rebalance your humors. And yes, the bloodletting was also often done with leeches, or even through crude cuts. You can only imagine how you'd feel if your doctor recommended that you bleed out to get better. It was a time of trial and error, and most treatments were wildly ineffective or downright dangerous. Some of the medicines prescribed were little more than folk remedies, like herbal concoctions, which were, at best, placebo treatments. Some doctors even recommended a cure involving bathing in vinegar or, even more bizarrely, walking around with a piece of coral in your mouth. Yet despite the clear lack of real progress, these medical practitioners were all that stood between you and certain death. And so, as you wait for the doctor to return with their next bizarre prescription, you wonder if anyone really has the answers. Could the doctors wearing bird masks actually help? Or were they just as much victims of the plague as the rest of us? Historians are still debating the extent to which these strange practices were driven by medical necessity or simple superstition. Some say they were just doing what they thought was best with the little knowledge they had, while others claim that these practices did more harm than good. What we do know for sure is that the appearance of the plague doctor and the surreal world of medieval medicine would go on to leave an indelible mark on history. Perhaps, in some strange way, it was the beginning of medical practices we would later come to recognize as modern-day science. Or maybe it was just a bizarre, eerie chapter that people would eventually look back on and say, well, at least we've come a long way since then. You're probably starting to feel like the whole world's gone mad. First, there's the plague doctor in his bird mask, and now it seems like every doctor in the land is recommending the same thing: bloodletting. Yes, you heard right. The prescription for nearly every ailment, from headaches to the plague itself, involved making you bleed. You might wonder, how did people fall for this? And more importantly, why did anyone think that bleeding out your life force was a good idea? You probably won't survive this. Bloodletting, as bizarre as it sounds today, was considered the gold standard of treatment in the medieval period. The basic idea behind it was that your body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if these humors got out of balance, illness would follow. Since blood was considered the most important humor, it was the first to be blamed for disease. If you were unlucky enough to catch the plague, or if you were feeling off, bloodletting was the go-to method for a cure, Imagine you're in the doctor's office. You're already feverish and nauseous, and then the doctor informs you that the key to your recovery is a good, old fashioned bleeding session. The doctor might use a sharp instrument, usually a lancet or a specially designed knife, to make an incision and let your blood pour out. They could even attach leeches or use cupping, a method where glass cups were placed on the skin and then heated, creating a vacuum to draw blood to the surface. Sometimes they'd bleed you in multiple places, believing that by removing enough blood, they'd be rebalancing your humors and giving your body the chance to fight off the illness. Historians still argue whether bloodletting was as ineffective as we think. Some point out that bloodletting was a standard practice for centuries in Europe and the Middle East, long before the Black Death. It was also used by some of the most renowned doctors of the time, like Hippocrates and Galen, who believed in the importance of balancing the humors. But the question remains, did it ever actually work? Sure, it might have helped relieve some symptoms temporarily, but it's hard to believe that losing copious amounts of blood helped anyone survive the plague. Now, let's be real here. When you look at it through modern eyes, bloodletting seems like an incredibly dangerous, almost laughable practice. In fact, many people died from it, literally bled to death in the hands of medical professionals who thought they were doing the right thing. There's no better way to ensure you don't survive an illness than to lose enough blood to make you weaker. The idea that this would purge the body of toxins might have made sense in theory, but in practice, it was often a death sentence. In medieval times, though, bloodletting was considered one of the few tools at the disposal of physicians. It was a form of treatment that showed the limits of medical knowledge at the time. They didn't have any real understanding of how diseases like the plague spread, and with no antibiotics or vaccines, they turned to what they knew, ancient theories about humors. The result, you were subjected to methods that did more harm than good, and if you weren't careful, bloodletting could be overdone. The treatment could leave you so weak and depleted that you were more vulnerable to the disease. In some cases, people were bled multiple times in a single day, often with disastrous results. You can't help but wonder how people felt when the doctor insisted they had to be bled again. What was going through their minds as they lay there, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, regardless of how much blood they lost. Even today, bloodletting lingers in some circles as an alternative treatment, although modern versions like therapeutic phlebotomy are far less dramatic and are only used to treat specific conditions like hemochromatosis. But in the days of the Black Death, bloodletting was the go-to treatment for nearly everything, from fevers to infections to the plague itself. While it may have had some symbolic power, it certainly didn't offer much in the way of actual healing. Historians still debate whether any other treatments might have been more effective than bloodletting. Was it the lack of proper hygiene? Or was it the sheer volume of misinformation circulating at the time? Regardless of the cause, one thing's for sure, the medieval medical world was one where science took a back seat to tradition, and you, the patient, were caught in the crossfire. It's hard not to feel a little sorry for those who placed their trust in these medieval remedies. They didn't have the knowledge we have today, and as a result, they were left to rely on practices that had no basis in reality. But what does it say about medieval society? A society that was so desperate to find answers, to find hope, that they turned to the very things that were slowly killing them In the face of a pandemic, it seems the medieval world tried to use everything at its disposal, even if it meant bleeding its patients dry. As you sit in your home, listening to the gossip and whispers about the plague, you begin to hear a common refrain among the villagers. The disease is carried by miasma, or bad air. It's a theory that's everywhere, and it sounds almost scientific. The air, they say, is contaminated with poisonous vapors that bring sickness. In fact, this idea of miasma was so widely believed that it became the official explanation for many diseases, not just the plague. The theory's popularity could be blamed on the fact that sickness often seemed to appear alongside unpleasant odors, decaying bodies, rotting food, and the overall filth of medieval cities. It makes sense, right? You can't ignore the fact that the stench of death seems to linger in the air as plague victims drop one by one. You probably won't survive this. So, imagine, for a moment, that you're living in a medieval city. The streets are cramped, the sewage runs openly, and the general cleanliness is, well, less than ideal. You're constantly surrounded by filth and decay. The theory that bad air is the cause of the plague, though wrong, has a certain logic to it. It's easy to see how the sight and smell of disease could lead people to think that the air itself was the culprit. After all, air is everywhere, and it's the one thing you can't avoid. Right. But here's the thing. Miasma was a widespread belief that persisted for centuries, long before germ theory was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. People believed that bad air was literally a poisonous substance floating around, ready to